Hello, everyone. This is Vikram Prakash, and you are yet once again listening to Architecture Talk, this podcast dedicated to interrogating the frontiers of architectural thinking by conversations and provocative discussions with those who are at the very forefront, at the frontiers of thinking, both within the discipline of architecture and without. Today I'm speaking with Mindy Seu, who is a graphic designer, an artist, and a DR Des from the GSD, and who has recently published a fascinating book, a co-collaborative publication called the Cyberfeminism Index, in which she and her collaborators and designers have put together all the references, all the articles that relate to feminist thinking in the cyber world, and have put it together in a manner which itself can be described as a feminist practice. It's a fascinating conversation, and I also dwell a little bit into her past history working with avant-garde publications from the early 1960s. I hope you enjoy this conversation. As usual, if you want to reach me, you can reach me at vikram.prakash@gmail.com, and I love to get feedback and any suggestions you have for people whom I might talk to. Here we go.
Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hi, Mindy Seu. Welcome to Architecture Talk. It's such a pleasure to be interviewing and having this conversation with you today. I know you are going to be speaking here in Seattle as part of Space.City. And I was introduced to you by Amelia, who was a former editor of Architecture Talk podcast. And she was so excited. She's like, Vikram, you have to talk to Mindy Seu. And as I've looked through your work, I have to say, I think she was right. You have such an exciting and very interesting profile of work. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Vikram. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to chat as well.
So, I have spent some time online on the digital version of the Cyberfeminism Index, which you have put together and designed by a number of people and with a lot of contributions. And this is both a digital work and a hard copy work. And it sort of riffs and indexes between those things, between the digital and the hard copy world in many interesting ways. It has a view on feminism, sort of a very familiar reading on feminism from my perspective, as a kind of a heteroglossia, I was to put it in simple. And it has a reading of the cybers. So all very intriguing to me. So why don't you start us off by introducing the Cyberfeminism Index, what it's about, and in particular, why so much emphasis on its format?
So the Cyberfeminism Index was started about 4 years ago. And it's taken multiple containers and forms since then. So the first was a spreadsheet, then it moved to an online database commissioned by Rhizome and the New Museum. And now, as you mentioned, it's a printed publication. So we've been going on a book tour this year, including Space.City in Seattle. What's exciting about this is while many compendiums of feminism might exist, this one really does focus on that cyber prefix. So this is essentially a critical use and non-use of technology from the past 3 decades, a collection of net art and online activism, and how that's kind of mutated over the years, especially in different regions.
Why was it important to connect particularly to the cyber?
So my background, I was trained as a designer, and I actually worked with a lot of architecture studios, typically doing like interactive signage and things, but the things I was doing on my own time was really involved with critical and creative code. So that was really my community, thinking about experimental websites, unintentional uses of hardware, subversions of the tool, essentially. when I was trying to create or find some sort of aggregate that combined theory and practice of these things, I didn't actually find many examples. So I just essentially started creating a bibliography for myself. And then when I put this online to ask others what was missing or what might be edited, it kind of snowballed from there and ultimately became crowdsourced. So the final form now feels like a living index in the digital site, as well as kind of like a printed encyclopedia in the printed copy. So they do feel quite complementary and speak to each other quite a bit.
Okay. So let's dwell a little bit on that. And you have talked about your interest and work in using the cybersphere or the internet or the digital world in a kind of a subversive manner.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yeah.
So, and I want you to talk a little bit more about that. And obviously, I take it you are looking to produce counter propositions and counterpositions to the more hegemonic aspects of the internet. Yes?
Absolutely. I think that when people initially see the title, Cyberfeminism Index, they assume that this is kind of an aggregate for women. But in the introduction and with various collaborators, we're very quick to say that it's actually intended for people who use the internet, which is the majority of people in online spaces. So with this, it's the mainstream understanding of technology now has been quite dystopic. And we start to see that even through the examples in this compendium, it feels like people have been working on trying to break down these hegemonic structures or reveal them for decades. And this is kind of a way to see the different forms that activism has taken place.
But you didn't just run into feminism. I mean, there seems to be a suggestion in your work that a feminist practice is particularly subversive or particularly amenable to this kind of cyber subversion. Would that be fair?
Definitely. But I think even with the root of feminism or its different strands like womanism, etc., it was never, in my view, intended to be a movement only for women. It was trying to kind of examine how all genders are impacted by patriarchal systems. And in this way, it actually feels very diminutive for a lot of the people who exist in society, and especially those who exist in online spaces. So we start to see some of the same trends that we see in physical space repeat itself in digital space. It doesn't seem as emancipatory as the internet was initially proclaimed in the 90s. So when you kind of aggregate all of these things, it's actually nice to see these through lines of how there's this constant mirror between digital and physical, and how in building these new technologies, it's not really about the tool itself, but rather how the tool is used.
The through line here is in the sort of more hegemonic practices, right, between the physical and the digital. But I seem to sense that in the sort of investment you put into the, if you want, technology of hyperlinking.
Yes.
That there is also a belief, if you like, of the, let's just say, more egalitarian possibilities of a hyperlinked world. Is that true?
Yeah, I would say that in my view, perhaps the most feminist technology is the act of citation. This idea that we're constantly trying to connect our worldview towards the influences that have shaped it, and trying to kind of move away from this idea of the I towards the we, the collective. So this type of co-authoring, I believe, exists in all forms of making and production. It's just we currently don't have a standard practice beyond the academic world for how we might actually give attribution for these things. So this hyperlinking is essentially a form of citation. The way we see it in the World Wide Web today perhaps doesn't have a mechanism for archiving, let's say, we run into a lot of link rot or misinformation, but generally the practices of cross-referencing indexes, bibliographies, these can all be seen as analog examples or precursors of the hyperlink.
Okay. So why don't you spend a few minutes and describe to me the organization of the Cyberfeminist Index?
Yeah, so the printed copy essentially feels like an index of indexes. I kind of describe it as an encyclopedia of sorts. It was very much inspired by countercultural publications like the Whole Earth Catalog or Survival Catalog, or even like hardware catalogs like McMaster-Carr. It kind of feels like a phone book, like the recycled paper, the weight of each page. It's meant to feel like a source book and not like a precious art book.
Right.
So within the book itself, there's essentially 4 different indexes that you can view. The main index, which is the encyclopedic portion, we have various collections by artists, activists, scholars to kind of curate different trails through that encyclopedia. And then there's the more standard views, like sorting by image or by author or by title, things of that nature.
These trails you mentioned, these are sort of hyperlinks that exist with various entries connecting one entry to the other, yes?
Yes, exactly. So within each of the entries, all of them are excerpts, and there's maybe 1 to 3 cross references in each excerpt. So you can kind of open it like an encyclopedia and find something that resonates or find something more intentionally. Or if you find something that kind of sparks your interest, you can use these cross references to find different things related to it, thereby creating unique trails.
So what were the concepts behind producing these cross-references? Like what was the methodology or selection process for that?
So this actually might be the most curatorial angle of the project, right? Because it's not necessarily linked by keyword, though sometimes that's the case. Sometimes I'm also trying to create juxtapositions. So we have Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which starts the catalog, but this is also then countered by a Cyborg Manifesto 30 years on, which is essentially a critique of how the Cyborg Manifesto has changed or might be read differently in today's context. So these things are just essentially trying to create a dialogue with each other, whether it's through some sort of conceptual link or some sort of critical link.
Why use the word curatorial? Why not authorial or editorial?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess it might be seen as authorial in a way. I would describe it as curatorial because the collection itself feels quite co-authored. Like excluding the front and back matter of the book, most of the contents are excerpts from pre-existing texts or descriptions or video transcriptions and things of that nature.
Edited anthologies, yeah, like an
Yes, but almost feeling more like a pull quote, right? Because it's not necessarily citations of these things. It's an alphabetical chronology of entries with their excerpts that were then selected by myself as a kind of a way to introduce or create some sort of provocation that might entice someone to dig in deeper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an excerpting practice with a certain amount of highlighting.
Yes, definitely. And I think in that way, as much as possible, I try to use the word co-authoring because even within all of these different entries, the metadata above describes who actually wrote that piece or stated that piece. And if it was submitted by someone else, they're also given credit within that block. So all of these people are also listed in the acknowledgements and pretty prominently throughout the online and printed book.
So you see this as a kind of a meta text. If there are so many authors, so authorship is retained, but the Cyberfeminist Index is not an authored work, although it has your name prominently at the top on the cover.
Yeah. So this is something that my designer and collaborator Laura Combs and I talked about quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Like, where should the byline be? Mm-hmm. And I think after examining some other references, we found that these compendiums or history books often have a byline that's quite invisible or tucked away. And this kind of implied a sort of objectivity, that the volume that you were seeing was some sort of objective truth. And by trying to prominently display my name, we were trying to suggest that this is a very imperfect umbrella of with rules of moderation created by myself based on my own subjective biases, because the definition of cyberfeminism has mutated so much over the past 3 years across different regions. So with all of this, we're trying to make sure that while other compendiums of cyberfeminism exist, this one has essentially rules of moderation created by myself that kind of filtered out what these crowdsourced entries might be.
You're sort of straddling the contradiction of being authorial and not authorial.
Yes, that is the tension.
And I wonder what other ways there might have been to inscribe authorship. I mean, Derrida used the strike through to both say and not say.
Yeah. I mean, in this case, it's kind of like who is essentially the facilitator and the maintainer, and who are the people that submitted and helped aggregate the different things. So there's a sort of interplay between what the different roles are for the publication.
So is this your vision of what feminism or a feminist practice looks like? I mean, I would read this simply as a format, without reading the actual matter, as a format, as a kind of a critique of authorship, authority, the sort of seated philogocentric narrative. Yeah, I mean, sort of a voice of authority.
Yes.
A critiquing of that, the critique that's not simply a reversal, but a critique that nevertheless acknowledges the inevitability of authorship. Is that a fair reading?
Yeah, I think so. I think the tension comes from how do you actually show the subjectivity, but also some of the primary roles. And I think how do you actually distribute that kind of thing and essentially give attribution to talk about what a collaboration or a co-authored volume might look like. One of the primary references when thinking about the structure or just the conceptual overview was an essay by Ursula K. Le Guin called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. So here she posits that the first tool is not the spear, which is a tool of dominance, but actually the basket, which is a tool of gathering. So this does multiple things. It not only kind of reshapes our history of technology and makes us rethink what technology actually includes, but it also kind of moves the narrative away from the individual hero towards the collective. And this kind of feels like a version of that. It's an expansive way of thinking about the internet and technology, and it's also trying to show what this gathering practice might look like.
And I was working on a global history text some time back.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that, somebody once after a presentation asked me was, he was like, all right, you have put in a lot of this material about, South Asian buildings from, 8th century CE and so on. But have you been able to identify the authors, the sculptors, and the architects who made these temples and buildings? Because this person was very upset that whereas in the Western fictionalized canon, we have produced these geniuses and these narratives that go from Brunelleschi to Alberti to Leonardo to so on and so on and so forth. In the South Asian history, a lot of this work remains anonymous. And when I was talking to somebody else about this, their argument was that not identifying authorship was a critical component of that work. So I guess what I'm leading all this to is, why bother with authorship at all? Why not just make the basket and call it a basket?
Well, I think that's a fair pushback, right? Well, I think in this case, because the basket is already gathering things and topics that have been produced and authored by other people, then erasing that lineage, I think, feels inadequate in a way. If we're already coming from a system where we are constantly creating these bibliographies and compendiums, then trying to kind of break down and interrogate those within that lineage feels like an appropriate response. But in a previous area, then perhaps considering how we actually attribute things to a region or a collective or etc. feels like an appropriate allocation as well. So I think it really depends on kind of what type of histories we're trying to push back on in this case. But it's a good question, right? Like, what would this compendium look like if it was just a compilation of themes without attribution? Like, would that actually be read as more or less generous? And I'm not sure. Perhaps this is an iteration for a future round.
Yeah, no, but it's a difficult problem, again, if you don't mind. So we wanted to produce a global history of architecture, and we wanted to undo the normal Eurocentric perspectives. So we thought that, well, a global history shouldn't just have American, French, Indian, Japanese, and all this history. We wanted to undo that. So instead of having a chapter on Indian history and Japanese history and Russian history, we just said 800 CE, what's happening around the world, 1000 CE, what's happening around, and we went down that way.
That's actually a similar structure for this catalog as well.
Exactly. So I felt a great kinship to that. And it felt, by the end, it was a curated work, but it felt encyclopedic.
Yes.
And in our case, after we published the first edition, the sort of feedback we got was, well, all that's really good, but, we need some essays, we need some stories, we need some narratives, because in our case, this was a textbook to be used in undergraduate survey courses. And we were required in subsequent editions by the publishers to produce some. So we produced narratives that preceded each time cut. So we had to restore a certain authorial voice for, I would say, in many ways, pragmatic considerations. And you are sort of, I hear you kind of describing similarly, well, there are all these pieces published and they are authored and they're indexed in Library of Congress under certain authorships. You can't erase them, so the authorship has to be maintained.
But that said, it's interwoven with pieces that perhaps are not authored, right? Like oftentimes, as a parallel to a temple that was created anonymously, there are also these various websites and experimental forms published online where the author is unknown. So in this case, instead of removing that piece because we didn't have a specific author metadata mapped onto it, we actually just included the information that we knew, which was some sort of description of the thing, the title of the work itself, and our understanding of the date published. So I think that these were able to kind of respond to the things that had a more robust metadata set because of the different spaces it was created in.
Right. And it's difficult to step out of the authorial authority, as Lacan would insist. It's not easy to step out of it.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I want to talk a little bit more about the joys of gathering in a basket.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to say, like why bother? The normal joy is authorial credit, right? I've written many books, so I know about that. But what are the joys of gathering?
As Sophia Noble writes, an essay itself is actually quite discursive. So you could also say that the joys of publishing these kinds of things, whether it's an authored essay or some sort of aggregate that we see in the Cyberfeminism Index, it creates discourse because of the different ways it's activated. So sometimes the people are creating their own collections. Sometimes this publication has been used for various workshops or courses. Other times people take the contents and use that as an input to create some sort of generative artwork or inspire a different creative form.
Yeah.
And the most literal version of discourse is through the book tour events. Like this for me was so rewarding because while the book almost acts as a snapshot of a specific moment of the website's mutation, the website is a living index and continues to grow.
Right.
So it has about 300 more entries than the printed publication does, and hopefully will grow in perpetuity because my collaborator, Angeline Meitzler, and I created certain design and programming decisions that might, quote unquote, future-proof the site as much as possible. So after these various book tour events, we find that we often get 5 to 10 additional submissions. So it's nice to see that we're constantly kind of breaking down what this structure is and perhaps trying to make it feel a bit anti-canonical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the joys of a woven text like this with a lot of open threads is that it allows a lot of add-ons and other voices to be woven in, and in that sense remains a kind of a living text.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you would refer to concepts such as excess and jouissance to also theorize these ideas.
Yeah, I mean, so the excess is something that's quite interesting because some people don't know what to do with this book. Mm-hmm. Like if you go to the website or the book, it can be quite intimidating also because it's quite thick. It's 600 plus pages. So one of the ways that we are trying to kind of navigate this is for people who kind of want like a curated tour, we have various people who created collections based on different themes like AI or indigenous futures or cybernetics of sex, where they select 10 to 20 entries from the index to help to kind of navigate what that space might look like. So this is kind of a helpful way to create different types of through lines because the content covers so many different fields and like subcultures within it.
This kind of open-endedness,
yes,
seems to be also a celebration of what we thought the internet was going to be in the early 90s.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, do you still believe in that kind of a, I would say at this point, utopic conception of the internet?
No, I don't. And I would argue most people don't also. And I think it's because more and more information about the foundational structures of the internet has been released, as well as clear examples of how the web has changed from Web 1.0 to Web 3, which in some ways we're straddling now. So I think that in Web 1.0 days, it really did feel like the internet was an emancipatory tool. Like suddenly you can connect with anyone across the world that has access to this device. But what we actually find is to this day, only about 65% of the world's population are active internet users. And even beyond this, it was created on this military-industrial complex. So the infrastructure of the internet is also quite guarded in many ways and has almost indicated how it might be used, which is why we see themes of surveillance and extraction kind of as the primary critiques in whatever we see in today's use of the internet. In Web3, perhaps we're returning to some of the goals of this, right? Like decentralization, anonymity, etc. But in many ways, the people who are spearheading this don't feel that dissimilar from the people who are creating the initial emancipatory push. One thing I also like to reference is Lisa Nakamura's book, Race in for Cyberspace. And here she actually states how in the 90s, when we thought that the internet could be this liberatory device, they felt that by going into these online spaces, you can suddenly adopt any persona and it might be an empathy device. So I could essentially put on my avatar could be a different race, it could be a different creature, etc. But instead of it building empathy, it's actually found to intensify stereotypical norms because what we experience in physical space are so embodied that we bring those behaviors into digital spaces. So I think this sort of tension is very much what we're seeing today. So while I wouldn't say, I do think mainstream was a lot of distrust and dystopic thinking about the internet at large, but it's helpful to see a lot of the different theories and works that have tried to combat this and kind of bring some of that joy and or trust back into online spaces. And we see some of that emerging too, even despite these platform oligopolies that are really running how most people engage with digital tools.
So you see it as a restorative project, a kind of a restoring some of the older joys and possibilities.
I wouldn't see it as like an ancestral worship project, and maybe restorative is a good description, but perhaps it's also meant to be expansive in a way, like trying to figure out the different ways people have used tools in a creative, subversive, and or critical way. Because, for example, if the majority of internet users now are feeling a lot of frustration with the devices because of how it shapes their behaviors, by bringing in other examples of people who have used it in an alternative way, it's kind of an expansive way of thinking about how we can actually start to think of these things.
Speaking of expansive thinking and ancestral, well, not worship, but ancestral relations, I was very intrigued also by the work you did earlier in your career, archiving the very countercultural, oppositional work of Ralph Ginsberg, whom I knew very little about, but I'm absolutely fascinated by now that I've spent some time looking at his magazines. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Ralph Ginsberg and the work that you did on him? And can you try and draw a line that connects that earlier work you did with this work over here?
I mean, certainly from a design angle. So my attraction to the publications you're referencing, Eros, Fact, and Avant-Garde, these were countercultural publications that were created by Ralph Ginsberg, as mentioned, as well as
early 1960s, yes?
yes,
Yes.
Herb Lubalin.
Yeah.
So these three sister publications, when I first discovered them, it was really the thrill of seeing this as a formal expression, right? Like really considering what Herb Lubalin was doing in terms of editorial design, publication layout, things of this nature.
So you were more interested in the design of the publications rather than their content.
Yes,
which
because
is also interesting to talk about. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, definitely. But I feel like because of my background, we had studied the different forms that Herb Lubalin had made. But this was a nice way to consider how independent publications emerge and also how we can kind of surface some of these publications that are in some ways difficult to find. So it wasn't necessarily trying to replicate the publication, but rather create some sort of digital complement so people can view all of this in a browser rather than having to have safeguarded access through institutional archives. And there are different organizations also pursuing this on a much grander scale, like the Internet Archive, for example. But when my collaborator of that project, John Gasnick, and I were trying to figure out like the best way to display these, we also felt like it was an interface exercise. Like, what is the best way to view an unconventional format? Avant-garde are squares. They're not the typical letter or A4 publications that come to mind. And they're also seen as spreads. So what is the question here was really about a physical to digital translation. And this kind of media experiment has been something that has really piqued my interest for essentially my entire career. Not only physical to digital, but also digital back to print. So it's this constant translation of media. So even on the Cyberfeminism Index site, there is a print on demand function where you can export your findings as your own PDF or reader. So I really like this act of safeguarding, this act of accessibility, and this act of media translation.
I see. Do you think these magazines were feminist in their time?
Or, okay, maybe first we should describe what queering might be.
Okay.
So, Judith Butler describes queering not so much as an identity, but more as a movement that deviates from the norm. So, it's this focus on deviation that I find the most fascinating. We kind of have the status quo, and we have examples that push past it to create various subcultures or the undercommons or etc. So in that case, there is a lot of parallels between what these earlier publications have done alongside what these later online works have done.
So you're connecting them as queer publications.
I would say so, yes.
And here, queer as deviations. I see.
Mm-hmm.
But can you connect this also? The first entry in your index, like you noted yourself, is Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto.
Mm-hmm.
And do you read the Cyborg Manifesto as also a queering call for? It's not a call for queering. It's a more a celebration of the kind of heteroglossia, multiplicity,
Yes.
and connect these two things for me: queering and heteroglossia.
But perhaps the heteroglossia is a form of queering if in our current structures we aren't encouraged to embrace heteroglossia. Like we're not encouraged to embrace multiplicity or co-authoring or different forms of collectivity. Mm-hmm. So by pushing that forward, that it's inherently a push against the norm. Mm-hmm. So I think this kind of breakdown is really important. But also within a Cyborg Manifesto, I think what's important was its focus on the ecosystem, like how these different things connect to each other. Mm-hmm. So regardless of whether there might be an apparent through line or a connection, because these things are existing in the same space, they're impacting different elements that then reverberate and impact other things. Mm-hmm. So I think this for me was really exciting, especially when relating to online spaces. It then so clearly connects to the built environment or materialism or ecology or etc. And I saw you furrow your brows, so maybe I'll expand on its connection to the built environment.
Yeah, perfect segue. Yeah, I was going there. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
So I think that it makes sense that we see the internet as a very ephemeral space, mm-hmm. right? Like we use terms like the cloud or etc. But these metaphors of nature also show how rooted it is in the land. Like the largest critique of Bitcoin is the mining, the huge environmental impact that it has. But we also forget that sending an email has a carbon footprint as well. The amount of energy it takes to power our devices, all of these things are tied to material structures and also the development of our hardware itself. So like the rare earth minerals in our phones are mined primarily in regions in Latin America where there are essentially non-existent labor laws. So this is a replication of how we see a similar group of people treated in online spaces, ostracized, data extracted, highly surveilled, distrust of government, etc. So regardless of what aspect we're really digging into, there are clear through lines because the internet exists in an ecosystem and all of these things are highly ecological.
Okay. But perhaps we can drill down a little bit. I saw you did your DDes from the Graduate School of Design.
Yes.
So you hung out with architects and planners.
All the time.
All the time. I wonder, I long ago wrote a paper on feminism and aesthetic pleasure in architecture. If the feminist discourse wants basket gathering and open-ended discourses and, heteroglossia and so on, what are the implications of this for thinking architectural design, the making of buildings?
Absolutely. I mean, I think maybe if we start again at the foundation, it's about considering what this material construct actually is. What materials are we using? Where do they come from? Who is gathering them? Are they extractions or not? And then when these structures are actually built, who is it actually serving? whether it's the part of a city or if there are different things that could be embedded that impact more interspecies relationships, more environmental relationships. It's never really just about the building itself, but rather all the different components and how that fits into the spaces we're currently living in. I felt like a lot of architectural discourse was really thinking about how the building itself shapes the behaviors of people moving through that building, but less so about all the things that led to the structure of that building, as well as where it was sitting within a larger environment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, that's a more, let's say, ecological critique, right? Mm-hmm. We did another project at the last Biennale called A House Deconstructed, where we broke apart all where everything comes from and its labor implications and so on. But let me push nevertheless, and because I'm so excited and moved by the investment you put in the design of the book.
Yes, yeah.
I wonder if you would wildly speculate that if you were to design a building, how you might be inspired by the design of the index, the Cyberfeminism Index.
Wow, that's quite a question.
Wildly speculate. So how would you begin to engage that question? Because the general critique of architecture is it's heavy, it weighs down, it has to be held up by structures, so it becomes by nature the image of stability, right? And by being the image of stability, it is indexed to the phallogocentric institutions of authority. So if we want to undo those, where do we begin?
So when I answer this question, excuse my lack of vocabulary because this is not my space, but please. One of the first references that comes to mind is, I believe it's called the Windsor House in California. Are you familiar with this?
No, I'm not, but yeah.
And maybe my remembering of this name is incorrect, but it was essentially a home that was modified over time depending on needs.
I see.
So when you move through this house, suddenly a different room of a totally different structure appears, or kind of stairwells kind of stop in unusual places. The windows don't quite match, but different extensions of this home were created over like a 5-decade period. So when you see it, it looks like a very unconventional structure, though still stable, but also shows how it was modified depending on use. It was never this thing that was constructed saying this answers all questions and it's perfect in its current form, but was very much allowing for not renovation, but the ability to add appendages onto the home. So this for me feels like an exciting prompt in some way. I still think that aesthetically there are ways to make this adhere to my personal architectural taste, which is quite minimal, but still I think conceptually it's kind of a nice bait.
Oh, so you're personally a slave to standard modernism, but theoretically you're...
I think generally, because I'm such a digital hoarder and because I've moved so much in the past 2 decades, I try very much to keep everything I have as simple as possible to stay away from like the chaos of what's happening outside. So perhaps that's a cop-out, but yeah, in terms of aesthetic preference.
It's a sanctuary, it's a refuge. Architecture is a refuge.
Yes, yes.
That's one of its primary purposes, is to produce the illusions of safety and authority, safety and control. So
yes, right.
That's one of our job descriptions. But I liked your essay on architectural thinking as where I read it, some kind of collage, right? I mean, it's putting things together. It's bricolage, really, found on your various things put together in a ad hoc but purposed manner, with the denial of the authored Gesamtkunstwerk. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. It always connects back to the same thing. Like, you have the body of the home, and then there are different appendages that are added to it over time. And similarly, you have a corpus, which comes from corpse, similar roots, which is, again, thinking about the body and all the different additions that might be added to that and modified over time. So I like this constant permeability or ability to modify and grow something as needed, depending on who's currently in that space or using that tool at that time.
I mean, I think this extends even further. And if one is to access, again, going back to Donna Haraway, Anna Singh, the current discourse on multi-species or the post-human, wherein the very idea of the home or architecture or the city
Yes,
has to be extended to be inclusive of non-human actors, right?
absolutely. Yes.
To just think of inhabitation itself as a kind of a de-authoring of the human animal. So we did a project recently, which in a sense, I was reminded of that when you were describing your house, Windsor House, which I will look up. You know, we tend to think of the city as the city and the forest as the forest. But actually, when you look at it, forests are deeply inhabited by huge amount of animals. And in that sense, the Amazon is the world's largest metropolis,
Yes.
except that there aren't many of us in there. So if we want to imagine the future post-human or multi-species city, we have to learn to live in the Amazon rather than having a few food forests in the city.
Absolutely agree. I think that, I mean, I'm calling right now from New York, and it really does feel like you're essentially in a concrete jungle with distinct pathways with trees and isolated areas for parks. And some of the most beautiful parks in the world, I might add. But in terms of easy access to nature and how that is very much distributed along class lines is essentially maybe a more narrow version of what you're describing.
Yes, very much so. So the project we just did at the ECC exhibition in Venice is Kishkinda, New York, which is transforming Manhattan into a forest city. It's a speculative.
That would be the dream.
Yes. Well, you should look it up. It's on our website. My colleague Mark Jazobek and I did. It's called, I'll send you the link, Office of Uncertainty Research. But in many ways, we have to learn to live in the same way, I think, that you have produced the book. Which is why one of the reasons I don't like Judith Butler's definition of queer as only countercultural or deviant or post-normative. We have to move beyond, I feel, this idea of normativity and deviance. Somehow that opposition needs to be deconstructed. Do you not think?
Yeah, I think that's a good call as well, because it's only considered a deviance if your primary body or root is what's considered the norm.
Right.
If you're talking to a different community and that's your primary body, then it would be a deviance, right? It's all about perspective.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to find ways of moving beyond that, which is what I think is interesting in the tension between the idea of authorship and gathering in your text that you were referring to earlier. I think is a way to, I mean, you're struggling and dealing with that same tension, I think is an important thing to keep centered.
Yeah, and I think also in all of these projects, the process of it has always been quite open and public. So I think the ability to kind of struggle with this in real time with different people coming in and out and the public kind of viewing it has been felt like a generous way to try to unpack these things in real time, especially in a time when maybe there's a fear of doing this because of cancel culture and etc. But I never wanted to kind of push something out that was just always complete, but really thinking about all the precursors, the way it might mutate in the future, and everything is essentially a work in progress.
It always is. Mindy, it has been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you for being a part of Architecture Talk.
Thank you so much for having me, Vikram. What a stimulating conversation.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Mary Lee. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.